The night was unnaturally still. A blanket of humid darkness hung over a small Japanese outpost, a forgotten speck of coral and sand somewhere in the central Pacific. The soldiers on watch could hear only the slow rhythm of waves colliding with the reef. Then, just before dawn, the horizon changed. A faint vibration trembled through the ground, followed by a low, distant hum. Mechanical, endless, growing. The ocean seemed to awaken. One by one, dark shapes began to rise from the mist. Towering silhouettes of ships. Dozens, then hundreds, spreading across the water like moving islands. Searchlights flickered. Radio operators froze. The U.S. Navy had arrived, not by warning, but by storm. And for the first time, the defenders realized the war had found them. The silence was over. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, it ignited a chain reaction that engulfed half the world. Within months, the Imperial Japanese Navy, once underestimated, became the dominant force of the Pacific. Island after island fell under its banner. Wake, Guam, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and countless atolls scattered like stepping stones across the ocean. For the first time in history, Japan's empire stretched over 3,000 miles of water, a vast defensive web of coral fortresses designed to keep the Americans out. On these islands, engineers worked day and night, transforming palm-covered beaches into strongholds. Airfields, coastal guns, underground tunnels, and bunkers were carved into the rock. Every island was meant to be a self-contained bastion, isolated but defiant. The soldiers stationed there were told that if the enemy ever came, they must fight to the last man. Reinforcements would never arrive. Surrender was forbidden. By early 1942, Japan seemed invincible. Its fleets had pushed deep into the Pacific. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines were collapsing, and the rising sun flag flew above territories larger than the Roman Empire at its height. But beneath the surface of triumph, cracks were forming. Japan's empire was expanding faster than it could supply. The distances were immense, communications fragile, and resources finite. Many garrisons, some with only a few hundred men, were marooned thousands of miles from mainland Japan. Their contact with Tokyo was reduced to faint radio signals and occasional supply submarines. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Hawaii, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was quietly rebuilding. After the devastation of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy was a wounded giant, but a giant nonetheless. New carriers were being commissioned, new pilots trained, and new ships launched every month. American industry had awakened. By mid-1942, the tide began to shift. At Midway in June, Japan lost 4 of its frontline aircraft carriers in a single battle, a blow from which it would never fully recover. From that point on, the Imperial Navy could no longer replace its losses as quickly as America could. Still, Japan fortified its holdings. It believed that the Pacific Islands, when armed and entrenched, could bleed any invading force dry. The logic was simple. If each island cost the U.S. thousands of lives to take, perhaps America would lose its will to fight. So, thousands of young men were sent to these outposts: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Truk, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, each one transformed into a fortress of coral and concrete. Most of them never knew how isolated they truly were. They waited. Through long, humid nights and endless waves of heat, they watched the horizon, believing reinforcements would come. They believed the Imperial Navy would protect them. But as months turned into years, the sound of friendly aircraft faded. Supply ships stopped coming. The ocean grew empty, and when the day came that they finally saw ships on the horizon again, they were not Japanese. They were American. The war that Japan had unleashed across the Pacific was about to turn back upon itself. In the aftermath of Midway, the U.S. Navy did not celebrate. It prepared. The Pacific was still a Japanese lake, dotted with airfields, outposts, and radar stations. To reclaim it, America needed more than courage. It needed a new kind of warfare. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, calm and calculating, understood that defeating Japan island by island would take decades and millions of lives. Instead, he sought to leap across the ocean, capturing only the most strategic islands, using them as forward bases, and bypassing others entirely. This strategy would later be known as island hopping. Each captured island became a floating fortress of its own. An airfield, a harbor, a repair yard, allowing bombers and carriers to move ever closer to Japan. It was a brutal chess game played across the world's largest ocean. By late 1942, the first test came at Guadalcanal. The Japanese army had built an airstrip on the island, threatening Allied supply routes to Australia. When U.S. Marines landed there in August, they found themselves in one of the most savage battles of the Pacific. After 6 months of combat, disease, and starvation, the Americans finally secured the island. It was the first time Japanese forces had been pushed back on land. From that moment, the offensive never stopped. Throughout 1943, the United States built an unstoppable momentum. Shipyards in California and Pearl Harbor worked around the clock. The Essex-class aircraft carriers, the Iowa-class battleships, and fleets of Liberty ships poured into the Pacific, more powerful and numerous than anything Japan could match. To conceal their moves, U.S. fleets sailed under radio silence. Aircraft reconnaissance and cryptographers broke Japanese codes, revealing where the next strongholds lay. The Americans no longer attacked blindly. They struck with precision. The Japanese outposts, once vital, now became silent traps. Many were bypassed entirely, cut off and left to wither without supplies or reinforcements. The U.S. would capture one island, build a base, and launch bombers to neutralize the next. Then, in November 1943, the plan reached a new scale. The target, a remote atoll in the Gilbert Islands called Betio, part of Tarawa. Barely 2 miles long, the island was guarded by nearly 5,000 Japanese troops, dug into bunkers and concrete pillboxes. They believed it was impregnable, a fortress that would hold for months. But to the Japanese, the coming invasion seemed impossible. Tarawa lay deep inside their defensive perimeter, nearly 2,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. They thought no fleet could cross that distance undetected. They were wrong. On the night of November 19, 1943, the horizon beyond Tarawa began to shift. Under cover of darkness, 17 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, and more than 200 other vessels gathered silently offshore. Thousands of Marines prepared in landing craft, engines rumbling softly beneath the tropical storm clouds. To the Japanese sentries watching from the island's defenses, the first sign of invasion came not from the sea, but from the vibration of the ground beneath their feet. The U.S. Navy had appeared out of nowhere. The next morning, the bombardment began, and the Pacific War entered a new, unstoppable phase. 1. The human angle. Life on the lonely islands, for the Japanese soldiers stationed on remote islands like Tarawa, Kwajalein, or Saipan, time had stopped. They lived surrounded by ocean, cut off from home, trapped in silence. Their world was one of heat, salt, and isolation. Every sunrise was the same. The endless glare of the Pacific, the faint rustle of palms, and the distant cry of seabirds. Supplies came rarely, sometimes never. Canned food rotted. Water was rationed. Many dug deep wells into the coral just to survive. Letters from home arrived months late, if at all. Radios crackled with static, offering only fragments of news. Most of the soldiers didn't know that Japan's naval power had been shattered at Midway. They still believed in the myth of invincibility, that the Imperial Navy was vast and eternal. At night, They gathered around dim lanterns, speaking in low voices about returning home, about families they hadn't seen in years. They trained constantly, repaired bunkers, and waited. Waiting became their existence, and so, when the sound of engines came from beyond the horizon, deep, rolling, mechanical, many thought it was a dream. But as the ground began to tremble and the sea erupted in light, they realized the nightmare had finally arrived. The tactical angle, the art of appearing from nowhere to the outside world. The sudden arrival of the U.S. Navy seemed like magic, an armada materializing overnight. But behind that illusion was meticulous planning, secrecy, and logistical genius. Admiral Nimitz's operations were governed by radio silence. Not a single transmission could betray their position. Communication between fleets happened through signal flags and coded lamps. Every route, every movement was timed to the second. The Americans used refueling at sea, an innovation few navies had mastered. It allowed ships to cross vast distances without returning to port, making them ghosts on the ocean. While Japanese patrol planes searched in the wrong sectors, the U.S. fleets slipped silently across thousands of miles of open water. Meteorologists studied wind patterns and cloud cover to hide their approach. Carriers positioned aircraft to jam or intercept enemy reconnaissance. It was a choreography of precision. Every ship, every destroyer, every transport playing its role in silence. By the time the fleets reached their targets, there was no warning. No scout plane returned to tell Tokyo what was coming. The first report often came too late, from the last desperate radio message of an island under bombardment. To the Japanese soldiers on those islands, the U.S. Navy didn't arrive gradually. It appeared instantly, overwhelmingly, as if the ocean itself had turned against them. The technological angle. The machines that changed the Pacific. The Pacific War was not just a clash of men, but of machines. And in 1943, the United States had perfected the tools of oceanic invasion. At the center were the aircraft carriers, floating cities bristling with aircraft, radar arrays, and anti-aircraft guns. From these decks launched hundreds of planes, each one capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. Then came the landing ship, tank, LST, and the amphibious assault craft, designed to deliver men, tanks, and supplies directly onto beaches. These flat-bottomed vessels could scrape across reefs and unload entire battalions in minutes. Supporting them were battleships like the USS Maryland and USS Colorado, whose 16-inch guns could pulverize fortifications from miles offshore. Behind them sailed logistics ships carrying fuel, food, ammunition, and medical supplies, ensuring that the invasion never ran dry. Japan, by contrast, was still operating on early war technology. Many of its garrisons lacked radar, had outdated artillery, and no air cover. Their communications depended on fragile radio lines easily disrupted by bombardment. So when American fleets appeared, they did so with thunder and precision, guided by radar, coordinated by air, and supplied by an industrial machine unmatched in human history. It wasn't a coincidence that they seemed to appear overnight. It was the product of a nation that had turned every factory, every shipyard, and every man into part of one massive, relentless machine of war. And as these machines drew closer to Japan's island defenses, the war would evolve from strategy to desperation. 4. The leadership angle. Commanders of an ocean war. At the top of the Allied command stood Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, a man of composure and calculation. Calm even in chaos, Nimitz understood that the Pacific could not be won by brute force alone. It demanded patience, logistics, and precision. He studied every island, every reef, and every Japanese airstrip. His maps stretched across the walls of Pearl Harbor headquarters, marked with colored pins showing fuel routes, air coverage, and landing zones. From his office, the Pacific looked less like an ocean and more like a vast equation, one that only discipline and planning could solve. Under him served Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, quiet, methodical, and unshakably focused. Spruance's style contrasted sharply with the flamboyant Admiral William Bull Halsey, whose aggressive instincts often drove the enemy to panic. Together, their dual leadership became the heartbeat of America's Pacific advance. One cautious, one daring, both deadly. Each operation was planned in layers: intelligence, logistics, weather, air support, and timing. Failure in one could doom thousands. Nimitz demanded precision, but he also trusted his subordinates completely, a rare trait in wartime command. On the Japanese side, leadership was fractured. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, warned that Japan could only dominate for 6 months before American industry crushed them. His death in 1943, when his plane was ambushed by U.S. fighters, marked the end of coherent naval strategy. In his absence, Japanese command fell into rigid doctrine. Island garrisons were ordered to fight to the death, a command born of pride rather than logic, and as Nimitz's fleets advanced, that pride began to collapse beneath the weight of steel and fire. The enemy angle. When intelligence failed, Japan's greatest strength at the start of the war was surprise. Its early victories came from careful reconnaissance and flawless coordination. But by 1943, that advantage was gone. American cryptographers had cracked the Japanese naval codes, giving Nimitz access to enemy movements weeks in advance. While Japanese radio operators sent routine transmissions from their island outposts, U.S. intelligence listened, recorded, and mapped every signal. Yet on the Japanese side, blindness grew. Their reconnaissance planes, few in number and outdated, could not cover the vast ocean. Submarines sent to patrol American routes often never returned. Even when warnings did reach headquarters, they were dismissed as exaggerations or delayed by bureaucracy. So when the American fleets appeared off Tarawa, Kwajalein, or Saipan, the reports were always the same. Disbelief. Impossible, one Japanese commander radioed before his signal was lost. No fleet could travel that far undetected. By the time Tokyo realized what was happening, the islands were already engulfed in flames. Intelligence had failed, but the deeper truth was that Japan had underestimated not just American industry, but American adaptability. The Imperial Command fought yesterday's war, relying on fixed defenses and old codes of honor. The U.S. fought tomorrow's, mobile, flexible, guided by machines, and unrelenting. The moral and psychological angle. The shock of reality for the men trapped on those islands. The sight of the U.S. fleet was not just a military event, it was a psychological collapse. For years, they had been told that Japan was divine, its soldiers invincible, its navy untouchable. But as the sky filled with bombers and the sea with ships, that illusion shattered. Some wept silently in their bunkers. Others screamed prayers into the roar of artillery. The Banzai spirit, once a symbol of courage, became a mask for despair. They charged into machine gun fire not from strategy, but from hopelessness. The sense of being forgotten, abandoned by their empire, haunted every man on those beaches. Meanwhile, for the Americans, the shock came in reverse. Many had expected quick victories, only to find fanatical resistance. Beaches littered with bodies, water turned red with blood. Tarawa, though won in just 76 hours, cost over 1,000 American lives, and thousands more wounded. The moral question of the Pacific War began to take shape. How much destruction was acceptable to end the war? How far could humanity push itself before breaking? Each island captured brought the U.S. closer to victory, and yet closer to understanding the terrible price of that victory. As the smoke cleared over Tarawa, the next targets were already being marked on the maps: Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, and beyond. The fleets would not stop. November 20th, 1943, Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The sun had barely touched the water's edge when the ocean began to roar. The first American shells whistled through the dawn, smashing into the coral bunkers that lined the beach. Within minutes, the entire island, barely 2 miles wide, disappeared beneath a curtain of smoke and fire. For 76 hours, Tarawa would become one of the most intense battles of the Pacific War. At 5 a.m., more than 17 warships opened fire in perfect unison. Their guns, some 16 inches across, hurled shells weighing nearly a ton. Each detonation lifted earth, sand, and men into the air. Japanese defenses, built over months, were pulverized in seconds. From above, carrier-based aircraft screamed across the sky, strafing pillboxes and dropping bombs. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and burning fuel. Inside their shattered bunkers, the Japanese soldiers held their positions. Most were deafened, blinded, or buried in debris. Their radios were silent. Their commanders disoriented, yet, even in chaos, they followed their final orders. Fight to the last man. Out at sea, the U.S. Marines waited in their landing craft, engines idling. Many were young, 18, 19, 20 years old, staring at the wall of smoke that hid the island ahead. They had trained for months, studying maps and aerial photos, but none of it prepared them for the sight before them. An island burning from end to end. Then came the command. At 9:01 a.m., the first wave of Marines began their approach. Hundreds of small landing craft crawling toward the beach like insects over the surf. But the tide was too low. Many boats struck the coral reef and became stuck. The men had no choice but to jump into the water, wading chest deep, through 1,000 yards of open ocean under machine gun fire. Japanese gunners, hidden in concrete bunkers, opened fire the moment the bombardment stopped. Bullets tore through the waves. Men fell one after another, some drowning under the weight of their gear. Those who reached the beach found no cover, only wreckage and bodies. For hours, the battle raged in confusion. Communication lines broke. Units were scattered. Yet slowly, the Marines began to push forward. Small groups crawled up the sand, tossing grenades into pillboxes and clearing trenches one by one. By nightfall, the first American flag was planted on the beachhead. It was not victory. Not yet. But it was a foothold. Inside the island's center, the remaining Japanese forces regrouped. Commander Shibasaki Keiji, leader of the Tarawa garrison, sent his final transmission to Tokyo. The enemy has landed. We will fight to the last man. None shall retreat. Moments later, his bunker was destroyed by naval gunfire. Still, the defenders fought on. Snipers in palm trees, machine gunners hidden in tunnels. Every yard cost blood. Every bunker became its own war. The U.S. Navy, from offshore, watched the island engulfed in smoke and flame. Admiral Spruance, aboard his flagship, remained expressionless as reports came in. Heavy losses, resistance strong, landing zone secured. To the Japanese, the sight was incomprehensible. Just 24 hours earlier, the horizon had been empty. Only sea and sky. Now, the ocean itself had turned into a weapon. The illusion of isolation was gone. The Americans had arrived. Not as rumor, not as shadow, but as an overwhelming reality. By the end of the first day, half of Tarawa was destroyed. Thousands lay dead or dying. The island that had once been called impregnable was now trembling under American boots. And yet, the battle was far from over. The next day would decide everything, whether the U.S. would secure the atoll or be driven back into the sea. November 21st, 1943. Day 2 at Tarawa. The island that had glowed with fire through the night was now a blackened ruin. The morning sun revealed a landscape of wreckage, twisted palms, broken bunkers, bodies scattered among coral and shell craters. The smell of fuel and blood hung heavy in the humid air. The Marines, exhausted and dehydrated, pressed on. Every meter of sand had to be fought for. Machine gun nests erupted from hidden corners. Tunnels spewed rifle fire from beneath the earth. Grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets became the tools of survival. The Japanese soldiers fought with grim determination. Many had no ammunition left but refused to surrender. Some detonated grenades against their own chests rather than be captured. Others crawled from the ruins with fixed bayonets, charging through smoke and gunfire. By midday, U.S. Sherman tanks, ferried ashore overnight, rolled across the shattered runways, crushing debris and clearing bunkers one by one. The flamethrowers ignited tunnels, sealing defenders within. The sound was deafening, a constant roar of engines, explosions, and shouts carried on the hot wind. From offshore, battleships continued their bombardment, hammering the far end of the island where resistance still held. The coordination between sea, air, and land was brutal but precise, the very embodiment of America's new warfare doctrine. That afternoon, the Marines reached the Central Command area. Beneath layers of rubble, they found the remains of Commander Shibasaki's headquarters. His final stand had ended hours before, his body unrecognizable among the ruins. Around him, scattered documents still bore the imperial crest, evidence of a command that had vanished with him. As night fell, Japanese troops prepared for a final banzai charge. They gathered their remaining grenades and rifles, chanting prayers beneath the moonlight. It was no longer about defense. It was about dying with honor. At 7:30 p.m., they came. Hundreds of men surged out of the darkness, screaming, firing, hurling grenades. They crashed against Marine positions in a wave of fury and desperation. The Americans, entrenched behind sandbags and wrecked landing craft, opened fire. Machine guns blazed. Mortars flashed. The attack broke apart under sheer firepower, but not before several Marines were killed in hand-to-hand fighting. When dawn arrived on November 22nd, the island was silent once again. Tarawa, the fortress that Japan claimed could not be taken in 100 years, had fallen in 76 hours. Of the nearly 4,800 Japanese defenders, only 17 survived. The rest were dead, many by their own hand. The Americans lost over 1,000 killed and more than 2,000 wounded. For the survivors, victory brought no celebration. They had seen what it took to capture a few hundred acres of sand and coral. The sea ran red, and the beaches were lined with the cost of progress. The U.S. Navy had proven that it could strike anywhere, at any time. The illusion of Japanese control over the Pacific was shattered. From Tarawa onward, every island would fall faster than the last. But the lesson was harsh. Each victory would demand terrible sacrifice. As the last fires burned out, Admiral Spruance's fleet turned westward. Their next targets, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, awaited beyond the horizon. The Pacific War was entering a new, unstoppable phase. The battle for Tarawa was over. But the war, and the reckoning it carried, had only just begun. When the gunfire stopped, Tarawa was silent for the first time in days. The island that had once been covered in palm trees and barracks was now a wasteland of broken concrete, blackened craters, and the dead. The tide washed over the bodies of Marines who had fallen in the surf. Their helmets floated like ghosts between the coral ridges. War correspondents arriving with the second wave wrote of the scene with disbelief. Robert Sherrod, a journalist for Time magazine, described Tarawa as the most completely wrecked place I have ever seen. There was no vegetation left, No color, only smoke and sand. For the U.S. military, it was a victory that came at an unbearable price. More than 1,000 American dead lay across barely 2 square miles of land. A shocking figure for so small a target. Commanders who had promised a swift operation now faced the bitter truth. The Japanese would fight for every inch of the Pacific. On the Japanese side, the destruction was absolute. Out of nearly 4,800 defenders, only a handful were taken prisoner, mostly Korean laborers and wounded men too weak to fight. The rest had died in their bunkers, choosing death over surrender. It was a reflection of the Bushido Code, the ancient warrior spirit that demanded loyalty unto death. As Navy engineers began clearing the wreckage, they found the remains of the Japanese command posts. Maps, orders, and journals revealed the defenders' confidence before the assault. Many documents referred to the belief that Tarawa could withstand 100 years of siege. The irony of that phrase haunted every man who read it. Across the Pacific, the American public reacted with shock. When newsreels showed images of the battle, the first time Americans saw the faces of their dead soldiers on film, audiences fell silent. The government had hesitated to release the footage, fearing it would demoralize the nation. But instead, it hardened resolve. The people understood now that victory in the Pacific would not be easy. It would be earned in blood. Military planners studied every mistake. The landing craft had been halted by coral reefs. Hundreds of Marines had drowned or been cut down in the water. Radios failed. Coordination between tanks, infantry, and naval guns had broken down in the chaos. From these failures came reform. New landing vehicles, the LVT-4 Water Buffalo, were ordered in massive numbers. Amphibious doctrine was rewritten, integrating air reconnaissance, tide analysis, and pre-landing bombardment schedules. The cost of Tarawa forced the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps to evolve. But among the men who fought there, the memory was not one of strategy. It was of survival. Letters recovered from the battlefield spoke of friends lost, of fear and determination. One Marine wrote, "We took Tarawa because we had to, but I hope to God we never see another like it." By December 1943, the island's airstrip had been rebuilt. U.S. bombers now took off daily from the same runway where Japanese flags once flew. Tarawa, the island that had nearly broken the Marines, became a launch point for the next wave of attacks. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, and Tinian. The price had been paid, and the machine of war was moving forward again. The capture of Tarawa was far more than a tactical success. It was a signal to the world that the United States had mastered the art of amphibious warfare. From this coral atoll, the Pacific campaign would accelerate into a relentless chain of offensives that would push Japan back across thousands of miles of ocean. Within weeks, U.S. engineers transformed the ruins into a fully functional base. Runways extended across the island, storage depots rose from the rubble, and radar towers pierced the tropical haze. From Tarawa, long-range bombers now struck deep into the Marshall Islands, softening defenses for the next invasions. The strategy of island hopping, designed by Admiral Chester Nimitz, was proving devastatingly effective. To Japan, Tarawa was a wake-up call. The Imperial Army had underestimated the speed, coordination, and industrial power of the United States. The Japanese High Command ordered a review of all Pacific defenses. Islands like Truk, Saipan, and Iwo Jima were reinforced. Their bunkers deepened, their garrisons doubled. If the Americans could take Tarawa, no island was safe. Yet, even as Japan built higher walls, the U.S. Navy was already building larger hammers. The success at Tarawa gave confidence to admirals and strategists alike. Proof that a direct amphibious assault on a fortified island could succeed, even at terrible cost. In Washington, President Roosevelt addressed the nation, calling the battle one of the toughest and bravest operations ever fought. Behind closed doors, however, the debate was grim. The number of casualties for such a small target raised questions about the coming invasions. If one island required over 1,000 dead, what would happen when the Marines reached the Philippines? Or Japan itself? Still, morale among the troops hardened rather than faltered. Tarawa became a symbol of sacrifice, of determination under impossible fire. The name Betio, the main island of Tarawa, entered Marine Corps history as a badge of honor. Training camps across the U.S. showed footage of the assault, teaching recruits what to expect. The motto, "Remember Tarawa," spread through the ranks, echoing the earlier cry of "Remember Pearl Harbor." For Japan's soldiers, the fall of Tarawa also carried a message, one that chilled morale across the Pacific garrisons. The defenders had fought to the death, exactly as ordered. Yet the island was still lost. If Bushido demanded death without victory, what did that mean for those who survived? Many began to question the promises of Tokyo's commanders. In the months that followed, propaganda on both sides intensified. Japan portrayed the defenders as heroes who had inflicted massive losses on the invaders. America framed Tarawa as proof of unstoppable progress, the beginning of the end for the empire. Both were right in part. Strategically, Tarawa opened the Central Pacific route, the most direct path to Japan. Within a year, U.S. bombers would strike Tokyo itself, launched from islands that, before Tarawa, had seemed impossibly distant. But beneath the triumph and tactics lay something deeper, a shift in the psychology of war. The Pacific was no longer a map of distant dots. It was a graveyard growing by the mile. The human cost had been revealed in full view. As the last graves were marked and the final reports filed, one truth remained. Tarawa was not just another island. It was the moment when America realized what it would truly take to win, and Japan realized what it was now facing. The war would move on, island by island, until the empire itself stood surrounded. And from the ashes of Tarawa's coral sands, the road to victory and Hiroshima had begun. Tarawa was more than a victory. It was a reckoning. On that small ring of coral in the heart of the Pacific, the modern world witnessed the collision of two civilizations, one driven by industrial might, the other by ancient honor. Both met on the same shore, and neither left unchanged. The Japanese soldiers who died there fought with a devotion that defied reason. The Americans who took the island fought with a courage that redefined sacrifice. Between them lay the proof of what total war truly meant. Not glory, but endurance. Not triumph, but survival. Every inch of Tarawa's sand was bought with human lives. And yet, from that horror emerged something enduring. A new understanding of warfare itself. The U.S. Navy learned that technology alone was not enough. Precision, preparation, and respect for the enemy's resolve were just as vital. For Japan, Tarawa was the first sign that the tide could not be stopped. It marked the beginning of the long retreat that would end 2 years later in the ruins of its cities. For history, Tarawa stands as a symbol, a moment when the Pacific War turned from defense to destiny. The fleets that appeared overnight were not just ships of war. They were instruments of a new age, an era when distance and isolation no longer offered safety. Today, the lagoon at Betio is calm again. Coral grows where wrecks once burned, but beneath the quiet water, the remnants of that battle still rest. Silent witnesses to the moment the Pacific changed forever.